All right. So welcome to the SDG Symposium 2023, Cities and Nature, Exploring Linkages in Designing Solutions for Sustainability, co-hosted by the University of Tokyo and Springer Nature. Thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. My name is Hiromitsu Rakami from Springer Nature, and I'll be the MC for today's event. So this is the fourth time in the last 5 years that University of Tokyo and Springer Nature have collaborated to organize a symposium focusing on topics associated with the societal challenges and the SDGs. Today we are joined by around 1,400 registrants from almost 100 countries around the world, and we are very excited to deliver our program. This symposium will explore the intersections between cities and nature, both in terms of how cities affect nature, as well as how nature can help solve urban challenges. Beyond the focus on cities, this symposium will have cross-cutting themes that are reflected throughout our presentations and discussions, which are transdisciplinarity, equity, and justice. Before we start, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements once again for those who may have missed it. So first, for the on-site participants, please do wear a mask and use hand sanitizer during the symposium. Please set your phone to silent mode. Photography, audio, video recording is not allowed. Simultaneous interpretation is available from English to Japanese. Again, if you do not have a receiver yet, please pick one up at the reception desk. And if you cannot hear anything, please do make sure that the channel is set to channel 1. Lastly, the emergency stairs are located outside this hall at the back right corner and the left front. And in the case of emergency, please let our staffs know and follow the instruction from our staffs. For our online participants, we have popped in our housekeeping note in the chat box. Please do take a look if you have not heard the announcements that were made before the start of the symposium. To give you an overview of today's program, we'll be having an opening remark followed by 2 keynote lectures. Following a short break, we will have 4 presentations by our speakers. And finally, after another break, there will be a panel discussion with all 6 speakers. So without further ado, we will first have the opening remark from President Teruo Fujii of the University of Tokyo. Professor Teruo Fujii became the 31st president of the University of Tokyo on April 1st, 2021, with a 6-year term. Dr. Fujii's research specializes in applied microfluidic systems and underwater technology. Please, President Fujii, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. I'm Teruo Fujii, the president of the University of Tokyo. So distinguished guests and colleagues, good morning, good afternoon. On behalf of our university, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to SDGs Symposium 2023. So this is the 4th symposium jointly organized by Springer Nature and the University of Tokyo. Well, this time we focus on cities and especially how cities interact with nature, and as well as what synergies and trade-offs this interaction creates among different sustainable development goals. And currently, in fact, more than half of the global population is living in cities, with many cities in global south, and that, with a growing particularly very fast. And this extensive and rapid urbanization has caused fundamental shifts in how we build our cities and consume natural resources. Importantly, it has put huge pressure on nature in the periphery of cities and increasingly much farther away. So there's an urgent need to fundamentally change how we and our cities interact with nature, especially in the face of global biodiversity loss and climate change. For example, the Intergovernmental Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is IPBES, strongly suggested in their 2019 Global Assessment Report that biodiversity loss is accelerating globally, and urban activity is a major contributing factor to it. At the same time, it was also pointed out that cities will be crucial sites to enable the fundamental changes needed to reverse these patterns. Undoubtedly, this will require extensive and coordinated efforts between countries, cities, and stakeholders. This became quite obvious during the COP15, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference held in Kunming and Montreal. There was a negotiation on a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, whose effective implementation will hopefully curb the biodiversity crisis. At the same time, we must be mindful of the disparities and different capacities between cities in Global North and Global South to ensure that these efforts will be just and have equitable outcomes. At this complex intersection of cities and nature, I strongly believe that universities should not simply undertake fundamental research. We should strive to create the next generation of researchers and global leaders to tackle these challenges together. We also need to work closely with stakeholders from the private sector and the governments and the civil society to co-design innovative solutions that will transform our urban systems. These imperatives have been enshrined in U-Tokyo Compass, which is the statement of our guiding principle, guiding principle of our university. And we as academia recognize the need to serve the global public more actively while adhering to our values of diversity and inclusion. With these principles in mind, the University of Tokyo has embarked on many international and national and local initiatives. For example, the Green Transformation Strategy, GX strategy, is now a central component of our activities and seek to make our operations sustainable. For example, we announced in October 2022, or last year, the U-Tokyo Climate Action, a coordinated effort to achieve virtually zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 throughout our activity in the university. Furthermore, through the Center for Global Commons, we developed the Global Commons Stewardship Framework. And, first Global Commons Stewardship Index. And more recently, we proposed the Global Commons Stewardship Framework, that is to promote behavioral change of the countries to protect the global commons. So we're also very much committed to engaging in partnerships with the private sector, which we see as particularly valuable to co-design and co-develop sustainable solutions for the benefit of future society. For example, we are in fact jointly with Hitachi Limited. So we run Hitachi U-Tokyo Lab, and that is working on habitat innovation to explore how to create a livable city while making good use of digital technology. I'm convinced that the looming biodiversity crisis and climate change pose multi-dimensional challenges that siloed efforts cannot tackle. Working in such transdisciplinary teams with stakeholders outside academia is quite essential for the success of such effort. For those challenges, sogochi in Japanese, which is convergence of knowledge in English, if I'm correct. So that can help us overcome those fragmented efforts. And this year's SDGs Symposium provides us with an excellent opportunity to showcase some of the cutting-edge research within our university and reflect on how to engage more closely with stakeholders outside academia. And also, I am very pleased to know that we also had the opportunity to have a look at excellent students' ideas and solutions this year in the poster session. I hope you'll be able to have a fruitful discussion and to share various ideas with participants from all over the world in this symposium. Thank you all very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, President Fuji, for the opening remark. So shall we now move on to the keynote lectures? So the first keynote lecture will be delivered by Professor Shumei Bai of the Australian National University, who is also a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. To introduce Professor Bai, Shumei Bai is a distinguished professor at the Australian National University, and oh yeah, I already said this, visiting professor at the IFI at the University of Tokyo. Her research focuses on several frontiers of urban sustainability, science and policy, including drivers and consequences of urbanization, and the structure, function, processes, and evolution of urban social ecological system, among others. The title of Professor Bai's lecture is Connecting Cities to Nature, Environment, and the Planet. Professor Bai, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Urakami, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning and good evening to those who are joining online. So I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, the Springer Nature and the University of Tokyo, for giving me this opportunity to speak about some of these things that I'm really passionate about today. And I will have to say that being someone who spent 5 years a long time ago in this particular very fine university, doing my master's and PhDs, it really gives me added, pleasure. It's always really great to be back to here. So the title of my presentation is Connecting Cities to Nature, Environment, and the Planet. So I will try to talk about how urbanization and what we do in cities actually affect the nature, the broader environment, and also even the planetary scale system boundaries, and how we can actually transform such relationships towards a bit more sustainable end in and through cities. So urbanization, I always begin this sort of talk by saying that we are really living on an urban planet. As Professor Fuji just mentioned, over half of the world population are living in cities, and by 2050, over 2 billion more people will be added to the world's urban population, and 90% of this increase will be concentrated in Asia and Africa. So on the right lower side figure, you can see that China will be adding 255 million urban population, India will be adding 460 million, and Nigeria will be adding 189 million people to their cities. So it is really one of the mega trends in our society that is ongoing today, which has profound social, economic, and environmental impacts and implications. So urbanization is really one of the massive population shift from rural to urban areas. So why people are coming really to cities? And there are many different kinds of reasons. Some people are pushed out of their village. Some people are really pulled into cities by the sparkling neon light. And also yet some people are directed by the national policy, for example, like in China. But all we know, the real fundamental reason for people coming into cities is really for their desire to trace for a better life, better life for themselves and also better chance in life for their children. So this is really the fundamental driver of our urbanization. So people are actually really coming into cities trying to chase their dreams. And I think this is very important for us to remember in our effort trying to find solutions. So urbanization is also much more than just population shifting from one place to another places. Urbanization has always been a process of converting some of the natural land or agricultural land into urban land use. And this is one photo taken from Xiong'an area in China. I think it's about less than 2 years ago. In recent years, the Chinese government has decided to shift some of its central government facilities or functions into Xiong'an from Beijing. And that means suddenly a huge area is going to convert it into cities. And when this photo was taken, there are more than 200,000 people working on this construction, huge construction site. So we can see this conversion of land use from more natural land into urban land use is still ongoing and at a massive kind of scale. So it is not difficult to imagine that impact of such large-scale landscape urbanization on nature. And in their paper examining the relationship between urban growth and biodiversity and ecosystem service, Robert McDonald and his colleagues have established that urban growth have impacts on ecoregions, rare species, and protected areas that are localized but cumulatively significant, which is very important factor again to remember. And this is from a book actually edited by Thomas Elmquist, who's going to be speaking later today as well. So global urban land use is less than 2% of the Earth's surface, but they often take up some of the most fertile land on the Earth's surface because our ancestors has been really clever. They started establishing our cities in some of the best place on Earth where you can really support your sort of population. But this also means the urbanization and landscape conversion actually really means you're taking up lots of land resources and competing for land use with some of the agricultural land use. And in places like in China, where arable land is really constrained, with less than 1/3 of the world average per capita arable land, this is a serious issue. And in this paper, we really found that this landscape urbanization is actually driven and driving economic growth in the country. And there's a positive feedback between those two, which means it's really challenging to try to convert this, break this sort of positive reinforcing kind of cycle. So the impact of urbanization on the environment is not only local, but it's increasingly global. And I'm going to give you just one example. I think it was in December 2020, there was a paper that really grabbed worldwide attention, published in Nature. And in this paper, the authors established that the global human-made mass actually for the first time exceeded all the living biomass. So take one moment, think about it. It means all these sort of things that we anthropogenic product like metals, asphalt, bricks, aggregates, and concrete and plastic. The weight of these things actually exceeded the total biomass on Earth. And in this figure, they only show this, they compare this with the biomass on the dry matter basis. And some people might say, that's unfair, but don't worry. Even if you compare with the wet matter, actually the cross point only delayed for a couple of years. And we're really exceeding the entire biomass in terms of our anthropogenically produced matters. So it showed that in 2020, the global human-made mass actually totaled in about for about a bit less than 1.2 teratons, whereas, for example, if you look at the total animals on Earth is, weighed about 4 gigatons. Plastic, on the other hand, 8 gigaton. And if you look at the trees and shrubs, they total in 900 gigaton. But buildings and infrastructure, it's 1,100 gigaton, much more than trees and shrubs. So I don't know what you think when you look at these numbers, but for me, this really means cities. Because cities have the most highly concentrated infrastructure, the buildings and everything that is made by human beings. So this kind of human-made materials really coming into cities through a process, what we call urban metabolism. So cities are really a human-dominant complex systems that draws food, water, construction materials, and other products and materials or energy, and even capital, information, and people from outside of cities into the urban system. And they get circulated within this urban system, and some of them become the stock, become buildings and infrastructure, but others, go on and support the urban function and produce and support the production and consumption activities that are so concentrated in our urban system. And as an output, we produce industrial products, we produce other services, knowledge, and waste and emissions. These things are sometimes used and sedimented within the urban system, but sometimes it is exported to outside of the system, causing lots of environmental and ecological impacts. And this is only looking at the stocks and then material flows, but those stocks doesn't really become stocks, become buildings or infrastructure by themselves. They need to be driven by energy, right? So in this process of using this energy, we're also emitting a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So we already know that cities already emit 75% of all CO2 from final energy use. But this is only about just operating the cities we have now. But if you look forward and look at the need to build and upgrade the urban infrastructure in order to accommodate the new urban population and also provide some of a bit more decent living conditions for urban residents in the global south cities, then we probably need to release up to 226 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. And this is, of course, on a business as usual sort of scenario. So on the right, you can see building infrastructure to upgrade developing cities will produce about 109 gigaton of CO2, and building future cities to accommodate the 2 billion more population will again require 170 gigaton of CO2. And if you compare this to today's developed country cities, when they built their cities, the total emission was about 53 gigaton. So this is more than 4 times of all the developed country cities, CO2 emission. And of course, this kind of highly concentrated flows and impacts are really taking toll on the urban environment as well. So this figure on the left shows Shenzhen city, which is often cited as one of the marvel of the modern urbanization, where a collection of fishery villages and farmland really converted into very modern 10 million sort of mega cities in a span of about, I think, 40 years. But on the other hand, the right side is also Shenzhen. So on a not so good day, this is how it looked like. So you can see the air pollution in the cities, not only in Shenzhen, but in many cities in the world are really getting more serious, and they're really taking toll on human health as well. So the urbanization and impact on the environment, there has been lots of work trying to establish the linkages, and I wouldn't really have time go through one by one. But in this review article, we have examined what are some of the conceptual and empirical advances in the recent decade that has been advanced in terms of linking urbanization and the environment. So what we found, there has been several emerging trends and some remaining questions in these linkages. For example, there are increasing evidence on the amplified and accelerated environmental impacts of urbanization and this is not difficult to imagine. And also there's a varying distribution patterns of impacts along geographical and other socioeconomic gradients. And there's a shifting focus from understanding and quantifying the impacts of urbanization towards understanding the process and underlying mechanisms that are actually causing this kind of impact. And there's an increasing focus on understanding complex interactions and interlinkages among different environmental, socioeconomic, and cultural processes. And there has been a conceptual advance that calls for articulating and using a systems approach in cities. So once we have established this kind of linkages between cities and nature, environment, and then at a planetary scale, what is more important question to ask is what are we going to do about it? So I would like to mention 3 aspects in this regard. The first is the importance and the necessity of taking a systems approach in finding solutions. Because as I mentioned just right now, cities are human-dominant complex systems that are complexly interlinked between their subsystems as well as with their hinterlands, immediate as well as global scale. So it is very important that in finding solutions, we take this kind of systems approach. For example, in recent decade, I would say, or probably 2, we really started to realize the importance of nature in cities. And there are various approaches trying to adopt this nature-based solution. And Sponge City Initiative is just one of them. This is initiated by the Chinese government, which is trying to turn the cities into the impervious land of cities into more pervious land, so that we can turn the behavior of urban systems hydrologically into something like a sponge. So you wouldn't really cause flood in the instance of heavy raining. And also there are lots of attention about urban forestry in order to reduce urban heat island effect. And what I would like to highlight here is that there is probably a kind of tendency to try to say probably the urban nature-based solutions is everything, and that can solve every problem, which is really not true. I think I really like to emphasize again systems approach here, because we really need to combine the gray infrastructure, which is engineering-based, the green and the blue infrastructure, because each of them have different function to play within this complex system of cities. And the second point I would like to emphasize here is the need to reestablish the connection between cities and then the planetary level system function and boundaries. I think many of you have heard planetary boundaries, probably. And I would like to introduce some of our work in this Earth Commission, which is a collection of international team of 60 plus scientists trying to moving forward and then identify the safe and just Earth system boundaries, which is a bit of advance from the planetary boundaries perspective. So here, what we are trying to do is identify and quantify the safe and just Earth system boundaries in climate, nitrogen, phosphorus, biosphere integrity, and freshwater and air pollution. I don't have time to go into details. But what I'm trying to say is it is very important that we reestablish the connection between this kind of planetary level boundaries down to cities and companies through translation. So this kind of translation can really help cities to set a science-based target, which is measurable, actionable, and time-bound target that are dynamic and adjusted in the face of new evidence, and that is fair, reflecting the degree of responsibility and ability to mitigate the harm. And we know that science-based target really works. And this is, again, drawing from the same paper, previous one, that companies which are adopting science-based target setting, they have much more advanced and more stringent target compared to the companies that adopt a target, but not really science-based, and even compared to the national pledges. So this really shows that having a science-based target really helps. And the third point, the last point I would like to emphasize is that setting target in itself is really not enough, and we really need to build knowledge that can help achieve transition and transformation in and through cities. And here I would like to just very quickly highlight a couple of works, our ongoing and recent works, try to see what cities are doing or what we can do to help cities on their journey. So one of the focus we do here is really try to see, looking at some of the very innovative initiatives that cities are doing, what we call urban sustainability experiments. So here in this paper, I think we, for the first time, defined what we mean by urban sustainability experiments, and then try to understand the patterns across different cases, because many of these are individual cases, and very often they're dismissed as anecdotal, but they're not. There are some fundamental common knowledges that can be extracted from looking at them. And it's, of course, really important to look into detail what each of these front-runner cities are doing. And in this paper, we looked at Kitakyushu City, which is from Japan, which is one of the really highly internationally acclaimed city that are highly successful in their sustainability journey. And it is also very important to ask the question, how these urban experiments or successful initiatives in individual cities can actually work across different cities. Again, there are lots of conceptual as well as empirical questions to be asked here. And also, it is important to see, can these policy learnings from these individual cities be upscaled to actually influence national policy or national institutional structure or their policy, so that we can bring about the large-scale systemic changes beyond cities. And it is really important to achieve this kind of large-scale transition through cities. And in this paper, we explored what is the role of cities in actually growing and encouraging, enabling some of the nascent industry, and then thereby enable the energy transition towards more green industry. And here we show that cities are really leading some of the hydrogen energy development, even compared to their national government. But on the other hand, without the proper guidance of national government, sometimes cities can go straight away, they just chase the industrial benefit rather than really trying to make sure that the hydrogen energy can be really developed in a green sort of way. So I'll stop there, and here are some of the references I mentioned in this talk, and thank you so much for attention.
Thank you very much for the lecture, Professor Bai. Okay, so it is time to move to the next program. Next keynote will be delivered by Sir Philip Campbell, who is the editor-in-chief at Springer Nature. Sir Philip Campbell has been editor-in-chief of Springer Nature since 2018. Previously, he served as an editor-in-chief of the journal Nature between 1995 and 2018. He has worked with multiple international organizations, including the UK government, the EU, and the US National Institutes of Health on science and its impact on society. The title of Phil's lecture is Research and Publishing for Societal Challenges and Impact. Phil, please do start when you're ready.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the university for your collaboration. In my talk, I want to start by just giving a quick overview of what we at Springer Nature are focusing on in cities in our publishing efforts, but just very briefly. Then I wanted to talk about an example of how researchers and policymakers actually worked together to produce a report about investment in cities in relation to nature. And then finally, I want to talk about something which I think a lot of universities are interested in, which is very challenging, which is showing how you made a societal impact. So this is Springer Nature. We have several imprints: Springer, BMC, Palgrave Macmillan, which is a social sciences publisher predominantly, Nature Research, and Scientific American. And we do have an SDG program, and if you want to search for it online, you will find it, Springer Nature SDG program. And we have sections of that website dedicated to each of the SDGs, and here is the homepage of the hub in relation to SDG 11, which we update frequently, and show the books and the journals that we publish. We have a lot of books on this in this area, actually. We also have journals, and MPJ Urban Sustainability is one, and thank you to Thomas for the efforts he has put in the leadership of that journal, and thank you to Bai for the contributions you have made to the, thank you Zuomai for those. We have another journal launching next year, which is Nature Cities. So you can see that the nature journals and the nature portfolio of journals, as well as our other journals, are really stepping up to the SDG, or what I prefer to call the societal challenges generally, because the SDGs are just one particular framing of those challenges, but it's extremely important to have an SDG focusing on cities. We have a tool called Dimensions, which helps categorize papers and books in their relationship to the SDGs. It uses machine learning and relates the targets of the SDGs to the subject matter of the papers. And so you can count the papers that are, especially the papers, but also the books in terms of their relevance. And if you look at different institutions, you can see what they are doing in this respect. And here is the University of Tokyo. And you can see that over the years, you have published papers relating to the different SDGs. This is the trend as we have documented it in this particular tool. And you can see a lot of work on health, a lot of work on affordable and clean energy, a lot of work on climate action, and substantial work also on education and hunger, and also on cities. So that just helps us and you. It is wonderful when you can actually measure what is happening out there in the literature. And just generally, you might be interested to know that the SDG literature comprises about 13% of the total academic literature, and the SDG-related growth rate of the literature is about twice that of the average rate of the literature. So this is an expanding area because, as we know, many universities, many funding agencies, and many governments want to see, not necessarily specifically relating to SDGs, research that is relevant to societal challenges. And that's what you're seeing happening here as well as elsewhere. So I wanted to focus on one particular example that I've been involved on. And I think a co-author of Zuomai, Bai, Timon McPherson, was also involved in this as well. And this is an exercise put on by the World Economic Forum called Biodiverse Cities by 2030. What was interesting for me with this, I was involved in it. I wasn't one of the experts, I was more a publishing champion within the project, was how they were focusing on the rationale for investment that mayors, city mayors, would see as a rationale for investment. So it was bringing to the surface, if you like, those sorts of discussions which all too often are very hard to see. And I will just make an additional comment about that. When you try and talk to city planners about how research has influenced them, which I have, it's very often that it has. It's very often that their local universities have contributed academic expertise to help them plan cities or respond to emergencies. But you won't find that relationship anywhere in the literature. So I'll come back to that in a different way, but I wanted to, this is one of the reasons I valued this particular exercise, because it was just bringing a bit to the surface how city mayors who are in this group, or ex-city mayors and academics, were working together. So Lena Chan, who is a senior research director at the National Parks of Singapore, and Mauricio Rodas Espinel, who's a visiting scholar at Pennsylvania, but was the former mayor of Quito. These were the co-chairs of this group. So we did a lot of discussions, the experts obviously going away and looking at case studies and coming back with analysis. It's worth mentioning that the former mayor of Quito mentioned in his little preface a lot of networks of city planners which are out there. There's the C40 group and so on and so forth. I don't think they have a strong research connectivity. That may be something to be thinking about for universities, actually. So they came out with numbers, and I will just quickly say these numbers because numbers is, in the end, what we're trying to change. So nature-based solutions are on average 50% more cost-effective than grey alternatives and deliver 28% more added value, yet they receive just 0.3% of overall spending on urban infrastructure. So you need to go to the report to see that, but that's a key point. They're also looking at land sparing, and so spending 583 billion on nature-based solutions for infrastructure could create more than 59 million jobs, including 21 million livelihood-enhancing jobs dedicated to restoring and protecting natural ecosystems. It's the next slide, I think, that is more about land sparing. But the impact of cities' nature-positive actions varies by sectors, region, and level of urbanization. So nature-based solutions for infrastructure are best applied to water supply, pollution, and climate adaptation and mitigation projects, and are most effective for cities in Asia-Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. The building and transport sectors, as well as highly urbanized societies in Europe, China, and India, may have more to gain from land-sparing interventions. These are numbers that you've already seen, so I'm not going to dwell on them. This is to do with the high proportion of people in cities and the growing populations and the productivity of cities as well. So this report that I'm highlighting here highlights solutions, but they say we must not ignore the risks to huge global productivity, 80% or $70 trillion in cities from floods, flooding, capital stock damage, droughts, urban heat, air quality, and green space. I'm sure all of you are familiar with those risks. The thing about this report is it's trying to show a way forward that justifies investment in this type of approach. So they say there is significant potential for cities to harness nature-based solutions beyond current levels of investment. The evidence suggests that the investment opportunity used in the same major applications as today could reach 113 billion annually in 2030, which is more than 4 times greater than current levels. While this constitutes only 1% of cities' overall projected spending on infrastructure in 2030, this is markedly larger than today's share of 0.3%. And it's therefore critical for cities to harness this opportunity if they are to reverse nature loss and nature-related risks, to commit to a nature-positive future and realize the Biodiverse Cities 2030 vision. And then land-sparing development in cities can have a significant positive impact, bringing nature back into the built environment, reducing the footprint of projected infrastructure spending, releasing land to nature, and generating new economic value. And these opportunities reduce business-as-usual land requirements by encouraging residential and office sharing, retrofitting stranded assets, reducing space used for landfill, repurposing areas such as car parks. And in 2030, they're saying land-sparing interventions could be worth an additional $469 billion in annual investment opportunities, and that doesn't include the spin-off business opportunities that will arise in those environments. So here are the types of solutions that we're talking about, the investment opportunities, if you like, and sustainable transport infrastructure and waste management solutions are obviously, not surprisingly, maybe the biggest. And then I'm just showing, I'm not going through the numbers at all, but just to show you the sorts of activities that, again, you're probably more familiar with than I am, how to think about these things. So that is illustrating the investment opportunity in some high-level way. But actually, in this report, the case studies are interesting because they give examples of how in Africa and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, people have actually implemented some of these different approaches and show how they are faring, how well they are doing. I certainly won't go into this, but it's all about the investment models that they put forward, the authors of this report. I mean, I was an author of this report, but I was more involved in the publishing side of it. But these different labels of investment, catalytic capital, exchange-listed funds, carbon exchanges, debt for nature swaps, and insurance for nature. I mean, that is a part of the challenge, definitely. If you want to get the investment, you need to have an investment community that is informed about these things. And some of you probably know much better than I do how near we are to a well-informed investment community to take these new approaches in investing approach. So this is more like the action plan and summary. So you can see down the side of this metric, steering direction from the top, coordinating across stakeholders. These are the actions that you need to take. And then across the top, you've got the stakeholders. And at the very end, you've got academics up at the top. And the intense blue is where they say, this report says the academics have most to offer, which is in fostering policy innovation and mainstreaming biodiversity data. But there are plenty of other blue spaces where academics can play a key role in helping the policymakers and stakeholders in city development change their ways. So that's the end of my little roundup of that particular report. But as I say, I highlighted it because I'm sure there are lots of reports, but this seemed to me one that you could see the city mayor type people, the city researcher type people coming together and trying to work out how to be persuasive about investing in these particular types of opportunity. So now for the final segment of my talk, I just want to illustrate example, and a particular example actually, of how universities make an impact in society. So the example I'm giving comes from cities, but I should just say one thing about the context of what I'm showing you. So around the world, there are a lot of universities who are thinking about making a societal impact, but how you actually do that and how you demonstrate it is going to become increasingly important in my view, because your paymasters are expecting you to make that impact and to show that you are making that impact. So in Britain, there happens to be a rather unusual national assessment framework that takes place every 7 years, where universities have to declare to central disciplinary panels what they have done over those 7 years. So every university department declares to its own disciplinary panel, this is what we did in academic terms, which counts for 70% of the weight of that national assessment of that university, of that department, but that figures into the university. So 70% is about academics, and then about 25% is about societal impact. So the way you document your academic impact is pretty standard, but how do you document the societal impact? So they developed a format that was first used in the 2014 exercise and has just been used again in the 2021. And that there is a database available now, completely free and very highly searchable, of 7,000 of those societal impacts case studies, which relate to individual research groups, what they did, and how the impact pathway happened. And of course, that pathway can take place years after the actual funding, the actual basic research. So I just wanted to show you a particular example of one of these impact statements so that you can see the sort of way it can be done. And I'm not saying that everybody should use the British system, but I do think the format is provocative and worth discussing. And I know of at least one university in Japan that is actively discussing it. So to just put this in context of universities making an impact, of course, if you want to do that, you want to do research that is indeed directly relevant to the challenges. You want to encourage multidisciplinarity because that's a key part of the exercise. And you want to pursue open data, open tools, and open access. But you also want to encourage stakeholder engagement at the early stages. You want to anticipate the pathways, and you want to document and reward societal impacts. So I'm just focusing on the last of those lines, but every one of these lines is a challenge, right? None of this is easy. So I'm going to move on from this because that's just making the general point I've already made. So in the template that I'm describing here, you have a summary of the impact, you have a background of relevant research, you have the detailed description of the path to impact, and you have the validation of the impact. And the validation is crucial because it's got to have credibility. And in this national exercise, there were panels investigating the excellence of this work, evaluating these particular case studies. And they use peer reviewers who are not academics to help do that. So I'll come on to the point I make about corroborative resources. Here is the impact study database, if you want to look at it. As I said, about 7,000 examples. It's very easily searchable. So I'm just going to whistle through a particular case study. So this is Imperial College. It's looking at air pollution research. Doesn't matter who they were in this particular case. And then they have a little summary of the impact at the top. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the impact. They have the research publications that were at the origin of this, which goes several years back, as you can imagine, given that you're trying to show that you've made an impact. And then they have details of the impact. And the details of the impact here, I'm just giving you a taste, but they've influenced health guidelines within Britain, local planning guidelines within Britain. They've influenced the WHO. They've influenced various other international studies in Europe, and so on and so forth. And it's in this very succinct, like this part of the document is about 1.5 pages or 2 pages, that they actually describe how this thing has made an impact. And then they give the corroborative evidence, which is some references to policy documents, supporting letters from people, so that the qualitative evidence is really crucial. You get testimonials from the people who say you have helped them make an impact, your collaborating partners in society. They send testimonials and they provide that evidence that is then submitted to the panels. So my belief is that any research group that wants to do this can do this anytime. You can just take this and put it on your website to say, this is what we did. And if you can get your collaborators to give you the evidence that you actually did it, that makes it even more persuasive. If the university wants to be more systematic about it, that's perfectly possible. So this is a bit of a dream, but I do think actually it could be done. There is an organization that looks at this. It is a group of people who meet every year, and at a bigger frequency too, but every year they have a big meeting called the Network for Advancing and Evaluating the Societal Impact of Science. And this network, ACES as it's called, you can easily find it online. And all they are doing is talking about how can we do exactly what I've been talking about, documenting societal impact and analyzing societal impact as it is being documented. And what you find at these meetings at the moment is that there is little progress, because you're going against traditional academic culture. You're asking people to make a big effort in an area that they're not having to make at the moment, and nobody's actually asking them to do it. The governments are not insisting on this, except in Britain. In Britain, it's a good thing you do it because you get more funding. So I'm just giving that as an example, but I think because it's the only way I know that I've seen out there anyway of doing it systematically, I think it's worth discussing. So this is my final slide, apart from my email address. Those red questions have got question marks on them because they are all challenging for universities to do. But if you're really wanting to make an impact, in cities especially, and show that you have, you need to try and bring this out into the open. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the lecture, Phil. Now we have come to the end of the first session. Now we will have a 5-minute break. In the next session, we will have 4 10-minute talks, and this will resume at slightly before 5:30. So we will see you again in 5 minutes. Also, if you do have questions, please do send them in via the Google form, and you can find the access by the QR code. Thank you. Okay, so I know 5 minutes is quite short, but I think we are about to start our next session. So before we start the next session, there is one point I wanted to make is that if you are sending us comments and questions via the Google form or by the form, please do let us know who the question is addressed to, as this will really help us with the panel discussion session. So again, please do let us know who your question is addressed to. Okay, so shall we start the second session? So in this session, there will be 4 10-minute talks on urban science and sustainability. So the first presentation will be delivered by Professor Thomas Elmqvist of Stockholm University, who is also a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo. To introduce Professor Thomas Elmqvist, he is a professor in natural resource management at Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University and is a visiting professor at the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. His research is focused on urbanization, urban ecosystem services, land usage change, natural disturbances, and components of resilience, including the role of social institutions. The title of Professor Elmqvist's talk is Trends in Urban Sustainability Research. Professor Elmqvist, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening to the audience. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Spring and Nature and University of Tokyo, for organizing this very timely symposium and a lot of exciting ideas and thinking around urban sustainability. So what I would do in 10 minutes is try to grasp what are sort of current topics in urban sustainability research and what are some of the emerging issues that could be of interest to explore in the future, or maybe there is a necessity that we explore them. So I started, since I've been part of building a journal on urban sustainability 3 years ago, I was trying to sort of grasp what has been the most dominant topics among all the submissions. So this journal, Urban Sustainability, we had about 450 submissions since we started in 2019. And here is a word cloud showing these topics. And there's some I want to highlight just briefly. I was sort of positively and glad to see that India and China are represented quite prominently with the submissions. That's really encouraging to have more submissions from not just the usual suspects in Europe and North America. And of course, this coincided with COVID-19, and we had a lot of submissions addressing COVID-19 and effects on urban development, and particularly health-related issues were also very prominent, and well-being. But and climate, of course. I wanted to make a sort of a broader understanding of trends in urban sustainability research. So I went to Web of Science and looked for the last 10 years, papers that would have keywords urban interdisciplinary, or anywhere in the paper they were discussing interdisciplinary approaches. And this is the development. And as you can see, there is some sort of inflection point there that would be interesting to explore why. Oops. One possibility that we have an inflection point could be that in late 2015, we had the adoption of SDG 11 and also the other SDGs. And 1 year later, we're starting to see quite a rapid accelerated increase in papers on urban interdisciplinary approaches. I was also interested in seeing in general what are the most dominant topics in urban sustainability research. And here is also a word cloud created on papers published between the last 5 years, and I picked the top cited papers. So these are papers with citation with 100 and above. And then I divided it up in global north and global south. And here, it's quite clear that biodiversity or green issues, resilience, ecosystem are topics that are quite dominant in the production of urban sustainability research from the global north. And then you're all asking what is happening in the global south. Well, we'll come to that. I was interested in sort of the development of research in the urban global south. So here's again the number of papers where the global south is mentioned as a keyword or in the paper. And again, there is a rather marked inflection point about the same time. So again, it might reflect the adoption of SDG 11. But this would be, I think, interesting to explore much more, that 2030, there will be a lot of evaluations of the SDGs, and I think one of them should be what impact it had on universities and research. Going to research in the global south, even if there is an increasing number of papers, there's still only a fraction of papers published in the global north. And here are some data from a paper by Harini Nagendra, and Xuime is also a co-author on that paper, looking at the difference between whether you have the first author in the global north publishing in the global south or the first author from the global south. So just comparing those two, you can see that papers dealing with the global south issues very often have a global north first author. So this is something that really needs to be addressed, and we as journals or editors of journals need to be aware of. So what about the content in papers coming from the global south? There is a difference. For example, waste comes up as one very important. Energy is also very important. And I think also in informal or informality, the fact that urban development in the global south often is taking place in an informal way. We have lots of informal settlements. But also within the global south, you have a huge heterogeneity of publications. So this is a study published this year on showing the number of urban studies from Africa, and where South Africa and Nigeria alone contribute with more than 50% of all the urban studies. And for many countries, there are zero. Then another important dimension, and something that is always often raised and discussed in papers coming from the global south, is equity and justice. So I was also interested in looking at the development over time using the same database, and we don't see a clear inflection point, but there is definitely an accelerated increase in number of papers addressing equity and justice in the urban environment. And often that is related to climate change, and often those studies will analyze how climate change aggravates economic inequality and within and between societies. However, I think there's also importance to give more attention to the possibility that the causation might operate in the reverse direction. So existing inequality and extremism might worsen climate change by blocking policy development, for example. And we need social scientists to address that as well. So from the journal Urban Sustainability, we have a call for papers to address urban inequalities and sustainability from all dimensions. Now I will look a bit more into the future and emergent issues, and just say something shortly on issues I think are very important. One is decreasing modularity and increased connectivity, that through urbanization, the world has developed from being very local with local connections to a world which is highly connected and with very low modularity, and even perhaps overconnected, which carries a lot of risk. And we know through the pandemic what these risks are. But we are also aware of that one crisis could connect to another, and we end up in a situation with polycrisis. And combining polycrisis and overconnection could result in really severe consequences. One example is, you're all familiar with what is happening in the world, that we now have a combined energy and food crisis, even though that was there were a lot of factors before the Ukrainian war that paved the way for the situation we have now, but causing, as an end result, the cascade of effects on food security, inflation, social, political instability. And we need to understand those interactions among the crises in a much more deeper. And I'm going to end with just another, what I think, very important emergent issue, and that is the demographic transitions that we have gone through over time. And at the right end of this figure, you see the post-urbanization with shrinking and aging populations, where we have a lot more to analyze and understand what are the consequences for example, sustainability. So in the middle, you would have a lot of the African and Indian cities, but to the right, you have the situation in many parts of East Asia and also many parts of Europe. And with that, I'm going to end and say thank you very much for listening.
So next presentation will be delivered by Professor Masashi Soga from the University of Tokyo. Masashi Soga is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Agricultural and Life Sciences at the University of Tokyo. His current research focuses on the interdisciplinary understanding of the causes and consequences of direct interaction between people and nature. The title of Professor Soga's talk is Human-Nature Interactions to Enhance Human Health and Environmental Sustainability in Cities. Professor Soga, the floor is yours.
Good evening. It is my great pleasure to be here and to speak to you today. I'm an applied ecologist, and I'd like to talk about the importance of direct experiences of nature in establishing a sustainable relationship between people and nature. So each of us has a unique set of interactions with nature. This includes, for example, visiting urban green spaces and viewing trees through windows at home, and gardening, and also listening to birdsong. So these human-nature interactions happen both consciously and unconsciously. Human-nature interactions are different from ecosystem services. Human-nature interactions are our direct sensory interactions with nature, but most ecosystem services do not require such interactions. For example, flood prevention and the mitigation of heat island effects are not generated from direct interaction with nature. There are two main reasons why human-nature interactions are important. The first reason is these interactions provide many positive impacts on health and well-being of people. I think many of the people in this hall know recent studies have shown that direct exposure to nature is associated with physical, psychological, and social health outcomes. For example, this includes the prevention of obesity and high blood pressure, anxiety and depression, as well as an increase in social cohesion and life satisfaction and quality of life. So I'd like to share the result of a meta-analysis I conducted a few years ago, which investigated the impacts of gardening on the health and well-being of people. the text is too small, but you can see that even this simple nature-based activity is associated with a wide range of health outcomes, including anger, cognitive function, life satisfaction, positive affect, and stress, general health. So it is increasingly accepted among researchers and policymakers that a regular contact with nature is a necessary component in maintaining a healthy life, and also nature experiences are potentially an effective tool in preventing several major physical and psychological health disorders, such as depression. So nature experiences are important not only for human health and well-being, but also for environmental protection. So this is the result of a large-scale question survey I conducted last year, which investigated the relationship between nature experiences during childhood and the probability of implementing pro-nature behavior, such as buying environmentally friendly products, organic vegetables, fruits, and participating in conservation volunteering. So you can see that people who experience nature during childhood are more likely to adopt pro-nature behaviors. So to confirm the generality of this idea, I also conducted a meta-analysis of the relationship between nature experiences and pro-environmental behavior. Yeah, again, the text is too small, but you can see that nature experiences are associated with a wide range of pro-environmental behavior. This includes, for example, recycling, energy conservation, donation, green purchasing, and also participating in conservation activities. So, of course, causality needs to be investigated further, but this finding suggests that improving personal engagement with nature can contribute to promoting behavioral change that are required to reduce environmental degradation, environmental issues such as climate change and biodiversity conservation. So, yeah, let me summarize the key points of my talk. Nature experiences can promote the health and well-being of urban populations, as well as increase their positive attitude and behavior towards the environment. So this increased positive attitude and behavior towards nature can also increase their opportunity and motivation to interact with nature, which can further create further nature experiences. So the most important point in this slide is there is likely a positive feedback loop between people and nature. And I think creating this cycle, this positive cycle, is one of the effective approaches to establishing a sustainable society where both people and nature can have positive outcomes. So future urban planning has a very important role in establishing this positive cycle. This is because, as Shumei discussed earlier, urban areas are now home to the majority of people. So these urban areas can be a central place in reconnecting people to nature. So to maximize the positive outcomes of nature experiences, I think we need much more research is needed in this field, and to answer some important questions such as which component of nature is important, how, where, and when people should interact with nature. I think addressing these questions will provide many important practical implications for future urban planning. It is also important for future urban planning to consider the inequality in access to natural environments. In general, opportunities for nature experiences are not distributed equally in society. Rather, they are very biased towards some groups of people. For example, it is known that global south cities have only 1/3 of the green space exposure level of global north. And also, low-income people have generally poor access to natural environments. I think this inequality access to nature is a really important issue because this can directly affect the health and well-being of urban populations. So this is my final slide. As I conclude my presentation, I hope you can understand the interdisciplinarity of the field of human-nature interactions. Last year, I proposed a conceptual framework to increase our understanding of human-nature interactions, which was published in Nature Sustainability. I found that each of these disciplines has a unique, distinct set of theories, ideas, and concepts about human-nature interactions. So I think to improve our understanding of human-nature interactions, much more cross-disciplinary collaborations and initiatives are needed. I think by doing so, we can transform this field into a more holistic science that utilizes the strengths of each of these disciplines. The scientific community at the moment is emphasizing such cross-disciplinary initiatives. So I think advancing this field is both timely and impactful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soga. So let's move on to the next talk. So our next presentation will be given by Professor Naomi Shimpo of University of Hyogo. Naomi Shimpo is a lecturer at the Graduate School of Landscape Design and Management at the University of Hyogo Awaji Landscape Planning and Horticultural Academy. Her main research interests are in the functions of urban gardening, especially in relation to diverse societal and environmental challenges such as social cohesion, disaster recovery, and climate change. The title of Professor Shimpo's talk is Green Space Planning for All, Thoughts from the Perspective of Urban Gardening. Professor Shimpo, please you start when you're ready.
Thank you for introduction and thank you for inviting me to this very great, wonderful symposium. It's really a great honor. So today I'd like to talk about urban gardening. This is my first main research topic. And I'd like to talk about urban gardening places as a concrete example of green spaces in cities. So it seems I am expected to talk from planning side, as I am landscape planning expert. So talking about urban gardening space as an example, I would like to provide some insights for green space planning for solving social disparities. So first, I need to explain what urban gardening is. So it is activities of urban residents to grow vegetables, fruits, and flowers, and so on, inside cities. So this photo is showing a community garden in Salzburg. So this community garden was made in a public park, and people who live near this park come together and grow vegetables together. And they bring back their products and also share the products with neighbors. Some community gardens have membership systems, but in many cases, they are open to public. And this is another case from Berlin, Germany. And this community garden uses a temporary vacant space. So they continue to renew the contract to use this land. And it's quite interesting that people developed many rural areas in the history, but eventually in the center of the city, they are cultivating the soil like this. So relationship between human and nature is very interesting through seeing urban gardening. Anyway, you can find similar cases in Japan too. And this community garden was created by neighbors on a temporary vacant land again. So this land is owned by the city, municipality, and neighbors started to these activities 20 years ago. So mostly retired people enjoy this garden and community activities because they are retired and they don't meet people regularly without such activities. So this is important role, especially in Japan, which is top aging country. So, and also what kind of land can be used is very diverse between countries. This is typical in Asian cities that urban and rural land use is a mix in the city. So Japanese cities have many farmlands which were formerly used by a professional farmer, and now because of aging society, they cannot continue many agriculture in many cases, and urban residents can start this land as community gardens. And like this, activities and lands were very, very diverse depending on the cities, but in common, they grow vegetables and fruits and other plants. So yeah, this is also another example. And significance of urban gardening is also very, very diverse. For example, food security is one of the significant role. They provide food, especially to people who don't have enough access to fresh food. This is very significant in North America or other developing countries, I guess. And social cohesion is also important. As I mentioned, elderly people can enjoy communication in the urban gardening places, and also immigrants and refugees can enjoy gardening with local people in the garden. Gardening doesn't need very difficult language skills, and people can share the purpose of activities, and they can spend the time together. So, and also eating is necessary for everyone. So it's really enjoyable and expressing culture, local culture, or culture of home country. So it's really good medium to convey their culture. So it can emphasize, promote social cohesion. And also disaster resilience is important role, especially in Japan. Earthquakes happens very often, so people can escape into the open space and also can get emergency food from the garden. And also in the normal times, people can go to the garden and get environmental education through composting or making beehives or something like that, and get knowledge about circulation of resources or biodiversity. And also, as I mentioned, composting is very most common activities in urban gardening sites. So resource management can be conducted in local scale. And at the end, biodiversity conservation is also significant in urban gardening. So inside the city, if you have garden, many creatures can live there and biodiversity can be conserved to some extent. But considering about urban gardening sites, many of roles should be, in terms of many roles, they cannot be achieved without using actively. So accessibility is quite important issue. And this kind of case can be occurred. So some areas have community garden, but another area doesn't have any access to community garden. This can happen in many places. So green space planning is quite important for every places. And I'd like to show one good example of Germany. So this is social city program. And now it's called Social Cohesion Program, and it started 1999 by funding by federal, state, and local governments. And it aims at revitalization of district with social and environmental problems. And it tries to provide comprehensive solution to the problems from both hardware and software perspectives. And then if the district is targeted, district management organization is established and do some many projects to improve the social problems. So, and community garden or urban gardening is often used as a tool to solve the problems. So this is one example. So this community garden was made in an area with high employment rate and low income and high immigrant rate. So through making this community garden, the local government was trying to promote communication between local residents and improve social quality. Okay. But thinking about accessibility, based on my previous studies, community gardens can be accessible in mostly from 1 to 2 kilometers. So people usually go to the garden on foot or by bicycle. So it means in many places, community gardens should be placed. Yeah, but it's really difficult in terms of planning. So green space planning is aiming at optimization of green space distribution, of course, and benefits can reach to people equally if ideally planning was conducted. But actually, there are many dilemmas. So the problem of land tenure or difficulty in evaluation of green space effects and influencing areas. And also, sometimes urban gardening places are made from bottom-up approach, so we cannot plan totally sometimes. So the problem is land and also analysis effect and also how to control activities. So we need to make circulation process. Actually, I made wrong direction of the left ones. But anyway, so we need to first identify target areas of green spaces. And to achieve that, we need to draw master plans of green spaces like this. So which area needs green space, we need to draw. And then we need to communicate with landowners or invent more effective evaluation analysis or support bottom-up activities. And then go back to identifying process. So, but this is really tough. So I hope we can discuss how to achieve this cycle in many places later in the discussion part. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shimpo. So the last presentation in this session will be delivered by Dr. Monica Contestabile, who is the chief editor of Nature Sustainability at Springer Nature. She joined Springer Nature in 2011 as a senior editor at Nature Climate Change and was the first social science editor in the Nature family. She then became the inaugural chief editor of Nature Sustainability. The title of Monica's talk will be Bridging Urban Science and Policy. Monica, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today and for the University of Tokyo to host me. It's really tough to go last because most of the things that I meant to highlight have been touched on already by the previous presenters. But maybe what I can do here is just try to focus on a few reflections when we try to talk about the importance and the challenges of bridging this gap between science and policy for urban sustainability. We know Jumei made an excellent presentation about the complexity of cities and the implications of, rapid urbanization. We do know that some of the impacts from rapid urbanization are interconnected Some are socioeconomic, others are environmental, but essentially the magnitude and the pace at which they're happening are complicating the process and the picture of cities. So how do we promote sustainable cities? Of course, this has been said already, and there is agreement. We need joined-up efforts. We need joined-up efforts from within academia and across different stakeholders. What could be a driver of this, a high-level driver of these joined-up efforts? Well, having a sufficiently cohesive and shared narrative of what constitutes urban sustainable development. What are the cities that we want to develop in the future? How do they look like? How do we prioritize to get there? So what I want to do, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of changes that need to happen within and across within academia and across different stakeholders to help with this science policy interface and in achieving sustainable cities. And one of the issues that comes over and over again, at least through the content that and the discussion that I'm having with the community from the point of view of my journal, is this fragmentation of governance. Governance from the local level, like city planning and cities authorities, all the way up to national, international, or multinational level, is disconnected. And this is not helping the thriving of cities, and is not supporting the kind of transformation they are able to lead to achieve a better and more sustainable future. So this has been already mentioned by Shumei, and others have already suggested that because what we need is facing complexity more effectively, we do need to have an understanding of urban sustainable development from a complexity research or a system thinking perspective. And indeed, this is already happening. Some cities are using this kind of tools, like from complexity thinking to understand spatial organization or the intricacy of governance. But ultimately, what we need is going back to that idea, what are the cities of the future that we want? And what should be the focus in this definition of urban sustainable development? Well, we need a more holistic understanding. This has been already said. But we should focus on cities that can cope with change and cities that ultimately are transforming into equitable social systems. And it's only by starting from, how people live in cities and how they interact with each other that then we can also improve on that relationship with nature, right? So let's look at the changes I mentioned. Within academia, we know that we need, so cities are growing fast. And it looks like, despite the momentum with urban research, it's still not catching up with the pace of change, the specificity of change of cities. And what happens is that we see a lot of studies, but mostly on large cities across the north, global north, and in cases also the global south. But what about the smaller settlements? What about those, where the capacity is not there, where the data are not there, the information is not there? We need to have more information about them. So one of the changes within academia is filling these gaps, right? And having a better understanding of the realities of cities. And then having more holistic research developed, which is basically asking of researchers to increase the collaboration from an interdisciplinary point of view, as many have said. This would help to conceive solutions that are more integrated, and therefore they're more able to cope with that complexity that we were talking about. But what about the changes across different stakeholders? Well, we need researchers to engage more meaningfully with these policymakers. Policymakers at all the levels, like the city planners know what the challenges of implementing solutions are. They know, they have the knowledge on the ground. So researchers should engage more proactively with those when they conceive that research. And then they should engage also with national and international policy actors who are in a position to move those evidence-based messages coming from urban science to the top of political agenda, which has been a missed opportunity for a long time for urban scientists. On the other end, there are the policymakers who need to actually be willing to engage with research in a more meaningful way. These things are happening, but not at the scale we need. That's the problem. And so what are some of the tools that are emerging to try and help with this mutual engagement between scientists and policymakers is transdisciplinary research and dialogue. So, and maybe adding at this point something that just occurred to me while I was listening to the others is also civic participation. There is an important role of citizens to be played for these solutions to be actually oriented to resolve the actual problems on the ground. The issue of disconnected governance, is starting to be recognized at the level of the United Nations. There is a recognition that, urban practice needs to change, and some reflection is seen at national and regional level and commitments, but it's still not enough. We know the cities were on the front line in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, despite not being most of the time well equipped in terms of resources, for example, in smaller cities, even capacity. They made huge efforts to cope and deliver solutions, but still not very well recognized at higher level of policy making and multilateral debates. So this disconnect needs to be addressed urgently. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, which has been touched on a lot by the others, but maybe just give few key points here, is that context matters. So too often the best urban scholarship is produced away from where the problems are. And this is partly reflected in the affiliations of authors on publication, as Thomas was saying, and we know this is a big problem, but it's bigger than that, right? It's the kind of interaction that is not happening where it should happen. So for researchers to be able to inform confidently planners, there needs to be a lot of knowledge of specific problems, where they happen. This knowledge needs to accumulate, and we need to have critical mass, and we need to have it across the board. We also need stronger efforts to engage with local practitioners on the ground, to build local capacity, and this is something also that was implicit in Thomas' presentation. Why are not we seeing these researchers from the Global South, publishing their research, producing enough research? So we do have a problem of local capacity. Partnerships with academic institutions and local administration are critical for the design and implementation of targeted solutions. They're happening, but they're mostly happening where resources are, which is either the global north or bigger cities in the global south. Again, this is not enough. We need to scale up these efforts, and because this is inherently inequitable at the moment, and that is fundamentally problematic for achieving urban sustainable development. And those are all my points. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Monica. So yeah, now we have come to the end of the second part. Thank you very much again to all the presenters. So now we'll take another short break. During the break, please do send in your comments and questions you would like the panelists to discuss about from the QR code on the screen. Again, please do address whom your question is addressed to. And the next session will restart at 6:20. Thank you.
exactly this. Okay, so I will just
Okay, so welcome back for the final part of the symposium, which is the panel discussion. If you have any questions for the panelists, please do send in your questions via the QR code now. This is your last chance. Okay, so let's start the last session. So I will now pass the floor to Professor Yasuko Kameyama of the University of Tokyo, who will be moderating this session. But to first introduce Professor Kameyama, Yasuko Kameyama is a professor at the Sustainable Society Design Center at the University of Tokyo. Her expertise is on international cooperation on climate change and sustainability indicators, especially in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. Professor Kameyama, please do start when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Yasuko Kameyama from the University of Tokyo. And we're going to start a panel discussion from now. The title of this whole symposium is Cities and Nature, Exploring Linkages and Designing Solutions for Sustainability. This theme is important for us, particularly because, as we've already listened to the presentations today, there are so many issues regarding the relationship between city and nature. And we find diverse dimensions for each of those issues. And that's why transboundary or transdisciplinary connections are indispensable to tackle all these problems. And to discuss this very comprehensive and difficult question, I'm very happy to have very distinguished panelists here today. And let me introduce to you those panelists one by one. On my left-hand side, we have Professor Shumebai. Thank you for coming. And on next, we have Sir Philip Campbell. Thank you so much to be with us. And the next, we have Professor Thomas Elkenbist. Thank you very much for coming. And then we have Professor Masashi Soga. Thank you. And on next, we have Professor Naomi Shimpo. Thank you for joining us. And lastly, we have Dr. Monica Contestable. Thank you very much for joining us. So we have very great panel members. And because this is a very comprehensive issue, we've came up with 2 questions to kick off the discussion. Those 2 questions contain very important key words or key notions which could be utilized to cross-cut different dimension of the relationship between cities and nature. And the first question is about the role of technology. Rapid technological advances are profoundly shaping cities. How may these intersections between technology and nature in cities of the future affect positively or negatively urban sustainability and the well-being of urban residents? I'm bringing up this, the role of technology, mainly because I myself work on climate change. And in the area of climate change, technology is really one of the fundamental conditions to discuss the solutions. And I'm wondering what's the role of technology in this area between nature and cities. First, I would like to give the floor to Philip, because in your talk, I remember you said investment plays a very important role when we discuss the city and nature. But what's the relationship with investment and technology or technology itself?
Is this okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. When I think about technology in the context of this particular question, I am thinking of it as a social instrument, as it were, rather than the technology itself. How the internet will develop and et cetera, is a key part of the infrastructure of what we're doing when we respond to the pressures coming up over the future years. And climate change is going to introduce enormous pressures. And some of those are pressures of anxiety for people's well-being, and others are the pressures of disasters coming from sea level rises, enhanced flooding, enhanced rain, et cetera. We know all about those risks. So let's think about two vulnerable groups in thinking about this. One is mothers of preterm babies and mothers of young babies. Mothers who are put under intense stress of any sort can be suffering depression for that reason, or they can be suffering depression for other reasons. But those feelings that they have can be then inherited by their infants. That's quite well established now. So therefore, if we can help mothers minimize those threats using social technologies, then that can really make a difference in the long run. And there is some very good work going on about that, where people have used online techniques to mitigate depression, to prevent depression even, and there are quite big studies showing that. So I just want to highlight that particular population group as meriting particular attention. And then the other obvious population group is young people. And if you look at all the different ways that mental health, mental ill health, and also well-being for young people, but particularly in the context of anxiety and depression, all the different ways that psychiatry and others are coming up with in helping them, social interactions, social connectedness is a key positive thing. And so using online social connection is something that people have begun to investigate. It's very early days in the research of that, and it's difficult research to do. But nevertheless, developing social connectivity in that way, I think, does have real potential. Now, I just want to add that online techniques of the sort that I'm talking about, it's a wild west out there, okay? You can, if you Google for techniques like this, you could find any number of different solutions. So you need, the standard approach to medical regulation, and you need something to help try and make sure that misuse is also minimized. But I wanted to emphasize that alongside everything we've heard today about the design of cities to help access to nature and so on, which is clearly beneficial for well-being. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting because technology, in a sense, generally, we think of relatively hard type of technologies, but you mentioned the importance of social connectivity related technology. Thank you so much. I would like to have raised the same question also to Thomas, because in your presentations, you emphasized the importance of the consideration of equity and justice and global north and global south gap. And I was wondering if any of the technology could be utilized to mitigate that kind of gap between global north and south. Of course, you can answer from different perspectives.
Thank you for that question. And I think I can start with being very inspired, actually, of reading one of the posters on how infrastructure was used in Dhaka, I think it was. That there are these dimensions of infrastructure, and most of, as Xume showed very elegantly, that most infrastructure we represent an enormous mass today, but it's designed according to a very old paradigm, and for an old world. It's designed for a carbon-based energy, and it's designed according to principles of predictability, which we don't have. And infrastructure is also often designed to serve one function and have a very strong path dependence, very difficult, low flexibility.
And often you could characterize these types of infrastructure in cities, which we have, as designed to be fail-safe. So the probability of them failing might be low, but if they fail, the consequences could be enormous. You have big risks connected with that. So what we need instead is changing that paradigm to design infrastructure that would serve multiple functions, have much more flexibility, address the uncertainty we have for the future. And I would say then use the principle of safe to fail, that the probability of failing might be higher, but if they fail, the consequences are much lower. And in order to achieve that, I think there are so many ways you could think of building hybrid infrastructure, where you integrate living systems with built systems to actually address this uncertainty. And the concept of nature-based solutions have been mentioned many times, and I also think nature-inspired solutions. The nature-inspired solution could be that you actually design into your infrastructure redundancy, diversity, modularity, things we know are very important in living systems for maintaining resilience. So there are lots of things. We have a huge task ahead of us in developing these new design principles, and also there is a huge investment needed to transform cities in that direction.
Thank you very much. You raised another very important keyword, safety. So we have to have a very good balance between the safety and resilience, and at the same time, sustainability of cities. And thank you so much. How about you, Masashi? You emphasized the importance of people being close to nature. And what does the technology come into play?
Yes, I want to answer that question from the viewpoint of human-nature interactions. I think technological advancement has both positive and negative impacts on the sustainability of the relationship between people and nature. On the positive side, technological advancement can contribute to reducing the inequality in access to nature. For example, a virtual reality technology can provide vicarious experiences of nature for people, especially low-income people, and also it can also provide opportunities for nature experiences for those who have physical and psychological restrictions. So, and also importantly, recent studies have shown that virtual experiences are also associated with improved psychological health as well as actual experiences. So I think technological advancement has many positive impacts on people's experiences of nature. But on the negative side, I think if people are satisfied with virtual experiences of nature, many people may argue that actual experiences of nature are unnecessary. So I think we need to understand which aspects of nature experiences can and cannot compensate for by virtual experiences of nature. I think actual and virtual experiences of nature are completely different. For example, actually walking on the moon and watching television imagery of an astronaut doing so are completely different. So I think we need to understand the differences between actual and virtual experiences of nature.
Thank you very much. Virtual reality, it has both sides, good side and the bad aspects, and we have to be careful about that. Thank you so much. Does anybody else who wants to jump into this? Monica, please.
Does it work? Yeah. I just wanted to add a couple of reflections on the role of technology. We have infrastructure, like designing, for example, buildings in cities that are more efficient. And then there is actual technological innovations, like better solar panels or better water treatment technologies. These are all relevant in cities, right? So like Thomas was saying, we have a huge task ahead because we need to think about these technological solutions in a more flexible way so that, and not with the standards we've had in the past. So, for example, one way, according to some, more behavioral scientists, is to design these infrastructural devices with the user in mind, right? But we need to also remember that they have to work for sustainability. So we're talking about sustainable cities. And so that behavioral input is also on the mindset of the designers. The designers have to change mindset, and that is not an easy thing to do. Designers and behavioral scientists don't really normally talk to each other, and they don't work together. So there is a huge gap to build in there. And we see this especially on, hard technologies, like you were mentioning, where designers and engineers are quite detached from the world of behavioral scientists. So I think for sustainability is especially important.
Thank you very much. I think you hit on a very important part that the process is very important. And whenever we talk about sustainable cities, I think we need a full engagement of various stakeholders, including citizens and different types of people and so on. Thank you so much. Does anybody else wants to add any comments? Okay, Shimpo-san, please.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to add just a small comment. In terms of urban gardening, during the times of COVID-19 pandemic, many people couldn't go to community gardens or other urban gardening places in public because many cities conducted lockdown. Or, for example, in Japan, there was no lockdown policy, but people thought we should have stayed at home. So access to the garden or green spaces was denied at that time. And then people still connected with each other through Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And once people could go out little by little, then people couldn't come closer to each other, but still people could know who was in the garden yesterday or today, and then felt a sense of connectivity with each other. So such kind of supporting role of technology is really significant, I guess, especially in crisis times. And also in the normal times, there are many new technologies to support gardening. For example, sensor of the soil temperature or something, and then people can get to know more about growing vegetables or the state of soil condition and so on. So only by human bodies we cannot know such details, but we can, if we use technologies in wise way, we can enhance our activities effectively. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Yes, COVID-19 made a tremendous difference in how we interact with each other and how we utilize infrastructure in cities. And yes, thank you so much. Okay, so let's move on to the second questions that I've given to you beforehand. It's related to justice and equity dimension of sustainable cities. In many cities, including in the global north and the global south, there is a strong feedback between equity and urban planning. Urban planning is contributing to inequity on the one hand, and lack of equity can result in ineffective urban planning on the other hand. So what are the implications for the interactions with nature and urban sustainability more broadly? And I was listening to all the distinguished speakers' presentation today, and I was wondering if there are cities in the global north on the one hand, and there are cities in global south on the other hand. And do you see more of a commonalities between the two, or do you think some of the success stories in one city could be utilized in any other cities around the world? And especially perhaps Naomi's presentation about the cities planning in global north, like Japan and Germany. And I would like to, I'll be interested to know if that kind of communityship could be exported to cities in global south. And I think for the other two speakers, for example, Shumei's presentation, Monica's presentation, I think the word city was kind of generalized in a sense. And I was wondering if you are also very much interested in the diversity of the cities. So may I start from Shumei?
Thank you for the questions. I think first of all, I would like to really start to talk about this planning for equity is really, really a big problem. I think we know by, 2050, there will be 3 billion people living in informal areas. And this, just remind you, these are places where we don't really have this mainstream or formal governance structure. And they are often living in a place that is not properly zoned for development. And they're living in houses that are not really properly built without really proper access to infrastructure and things like that. So I think the question or the problem is not only planning for urban green in some of these, considering the equity, but also, more of a building the communities themselves, entire communities, planning them with equity in mind. So first of all, I really like to say, this is a big problem, and it probably is much bigger than what we thought before. And that leads to my second point, which is the need to actually look beyond planning. I know the question is really focusing on planning, but I think it's important for us to really ask to what extent this is a question or problem of planning, and to what extent actually this is a question of actually managing and implementing and enabling and all those sort of things that actually beyond planning. Because even if a place is zoned as a land for a particular purpose, what do you actually do in the land? For example, what kind of trees you plant for a green designated place in a park or area? That makes huge difference. And in terms of equity, for example, I think recently we've seen some interesting approach. For example, like in Copenhagen, they started to, instead of planting beautiful trees and things like that in their urban park, they started to explore, can we actually plant some fruit trees? Which, during disaster, it can provide food probably. And not only during disaster, but also it probably can provide some free food for, people who are experiencing hardship. And I mean, Copenhagen is one of the richest cities in the world. But so coming back to your question of whether there is a commonalities of equity across global north and global south, there are certainly lots of actually commonalities. I mean, the equities not only belong to global south, but in global north, there are also lots of huge disparity in terms of green access and in terms of whose voices get heard in decision making and planning kind of processes. So I think it is really important that when we talk about equity, we look actually beyond planning and then see how do we start to engage different stakeholders and really listen carefully to people who are living, for example, if it's in the global south, living in the community, what they want, how they would like to address their problems, and try to really tap into the ingenuity of the community themselves, because they are the ones who actually knows the best what is good for them, right? So this is really linking back to my third point, which is I really like to advocate for a bit more, how to say, a kind of modesty or humility on our side as a researcher, as well as on planners, urban practitioners, and urban policymakers. Because when we talk about informal settlement and urban slums, things like that, very often we see this as a problem that needs to be fixed. And when we have that kind of mentality, it's always going down from top down, right? We try to fix this problem. But that doesn't really work. It really very rarely actually works. But on the other hand, when you try to actually mobilize the community and then, really having a humility to listen to them, there are lots of really interesting things going on, actually. For example, like during COVID-19, the 10 biggest favelas in Brazil, they started to organize themselves and they started to, mobilize donations, and they start to organize doctors and, medical supplies for themselves. And there are many that kind of initiatives in other parts of the world. For example, like in Philippines, I think some of the organizations started to, again, team up and try to buy lands outside of the informal settlement. And by acting together, they do have some power in there, and they do have a say in the planning process as well. So I would really like to emphasize the importance of a bit of humility and try to learn from what these communities are doing and they would like to do. So.
Thank you very much. I really like the last point. I really have the same impression that researchers should learn from other parts of the community, and there are people who can really voluntarily get together and initiate very important movements. And it would be very good if we could find how that kind of movement would be linked to also to conserve nature in cities or to come up with more sustainable cities. Thank you so much. I think we've learned a lot from your intervention. Naomi, may I ask your view?
Okay, so I was thinking this. So far, usually urban planning emphasizes on transport or housing issues or economic issues, and they are controlling such kind of urban land uses. And in terms of social and economic viewpoints, and there are not all the cities can have experience to incorporate nature perspectives into urban planning, I guess, and especially in developed countries, they have enough economic situations, so they have room to think about such nature issues. But in the global south, in developing countries, they need now economic development first. So they are thinking about urban development first. So nature comes later after the economic issues. So urban gardening is also found in global north mainly, as I searched. But recently, the trend is spreading into the global north, global south too, in terms of urban gardening. And in Asian countries, people use often rooftop spaces of buildings in densely built areas. And in Africa, they use home garden usually. And both areas focuses on food producing because they need food first. And including urban gardening, green spaces should be planned in terms of what kind of ecosystem services should be provided. And we need to analyze the services by using many indicators. And then, for example, indicators are in social issues, related to social issues or health issues or environmental issues. So from various viewpoints, we need to use indicators to analyze the services of green spaces. And we need objective and fair perspectives as well. In terms of to have such perspectives, we need not only experts from landscape planning, but also policy experts or transport experts or socialists. So various expertise is necessary to achieve ideal green space planning to provide many ecosystem services. And we need interdisciplinary team of various experts. In the case of Global North, there are many experts in various fields, but in Global South, it's not the stage yet, I guess. So at the moment, many students are coming from Global South to Global North to study how to analyze the effects of ecosystem services and how to implement policies or plan, I guess. So at this moment, that kind of trend should be enhanced. And then maybe 10 years later, the situation is totally different, I suppose. So now it's the time of changing.
Thank you very much. I can see the kind of dynamics of people becoming more aware of the importance of green planning and also inclusion of urban gardening. Thank you so much. How about you, Monica? In your presentation, you talked also about the importance of policymakers' role. So what's your view?
A couple of points. I think one issue is that with the development of cities that we're observing, the fact they're expanding, they're growing with urbanization, we see a lot of impacts, as we mentioned, and there is an equity dimension, or better said, inequity of environmental and health impacts in cities. And this is seen across the global north and the global south. It's quite severe. There are studies now of, even environmental justice and environmental racism that are emerging, including from cities in the global north, where basically there are patterns of, deprived areas, there are less affluent areas suffering from disproportionate impacts from air pollution, and those areas don't have access to basic health services. They don't have access to basic public transport, so they are contributing to that negative loop by using private transport to go to work, for example, and contributing to air pollution even further. So there is this growing issue of disproportionate impacts, environmental and health impacts in cities. And policymakers, can do something about it, obviously. There are some lock-in problems. Infrastructure cannot be easily changed, but certainly there can be interventions to try and ameliorate those impacts in areas that are suffering the most. Usually these are areas also where there are most segregated communities in cities in the global north. So it's really very unfair to there. There was one example that came to mind while I was hearing the others and the other comments, and is, for example, even the way we monitor air pollution in cities. In some cities, there have been studies that have shown that the way the monitors, locators, are located in across the spatial area, that it's basically inherently inequitable, and so it's entrenched in, because there has not been there has never been a proper priority of policymakers, right, to achieve more equitable and more inclusive communities. And so, yes, they have a role to play. They have to listen to the communities, like Shumei was saying. They need to learn from that. So there needs to be more participation from the bottom up. And and the feel of urgency that the way they prioritize their budget decisions for interventions, where the money goes, has to have equity as one of the priority, as an overarching priority in their normal exercise of their function, I think. And I know there are some pockets of cities where this is actually being funded, so projects that are embedding equity and sustainability into redeveloping neighbors, for example, are being funded, and they're being awarded even official recognition. We just need more of those. They're not enough.
Thank you very much. You hit up on a very important point about like a budget allocation and how the monitoring points are being chosen. And I think maybe that's also going to be related to what kind of research are much more needed in the field of like social science or governance. Thank you so much. Does anybody else wants to comment on this topic? Thomas, please.
Thank you. Yes, I think the social scientists will play a very important role in this, analyzing equity and all the challenging questions related to it. But I also think for economists, it would be important, because it's been well established, but on a national scale, that there is a huge cost of inequity in society on many, many levels. And I think economists could help by also scale down those analyses to show what is the cost of inequity for a city and what would be the gains by addressing inequity. So I think that could be a really important argument in this discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, as researchers, I mean, how do you measure or how do you define inequity? How do you address inequity? That itself is a very important point. Does anybody else wants to add anything to add? Okay, Shumei.
I think mostly we talked about how challenging and difficult it is to address inequality issue in cities. I thought I just want to highlight there are actually good way of doing this. There are actually solutions and good initiatives. For example, not to to my own home, but at ACT, the Canberra where I live, it's a city where you don't really see segregation almost at all. So I think the government has been doing quite well. What they've been doing is that there are social housing development, right? There are in most cities that is focused on, usually it's not in the best place, in the city and everything. So what the ACT government has done is that they don't designate a place for social housing. But they, for example, if you build a really high-rising building at the center of the city, some of the units will be designated as a social housing. And who is living in social housing, you don't have to know, because the government is subsidizing some of the housing, but you don't, people, they don't know each other who's on that sort of thing. And, in community new suburb development, even if it's really prioritized a really high value sort of land, there's a a certain percentage that has to be designated into low-income social housing type of development to be sold to that sort of population. And again, you don't have to know who those people are. So I think through these kind of initiatives, actually, the social segregation, which in many cases actually lead to this unequal access to urban green and everything, has drastically reduced. So most of the people, or most of the communities have more or less, equal kind of access. So I just want to say there are ways of tackling this problem.
Thank you very much. I think that kind of success stories can actually be implemented in any parts of the world, any cities. Thank you so much. Anybody else wants to add? Okay, please.
This is a slightly off the field type of point. When COVID happened, in my neighborhood, which is in a London suburb, suddenly people set up a WhatsApp network and began to know who each other was and what their problems were. And sometimes the problems nowadays, now that COVID is less, are about, have you seen my cat? But sometimes they were more useful, and sometimes they were about, this particular development is being planned, here is where you can put your feedback into the local council, etc. I'd be interested to know, in terms of equity, how much of that happened. It must have happened in lots and lots of places. COVID was a global phenomenon. Did it happen, is there not an equity issue, but I mean, did it happen equally in poorer neighborhoods, as in middle-class neighborhoods? I think there's a social phenomenon there. It just occurred to me, listening to people, I just wonder what that looks like. And in cities, I mean, it'll be just as important in rural neighborhoods, but maybe cities even more so.
Thank you very much.
So it's a question.
Yes.
What do we know?
It's an open question to all the listeners today. COVID-19, I think we heard that there are both dimensions. People tended to lock in on one hand and not to have conversation with the neighbors. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, there are new communications or new communities because of this COVID-19 problem. Thank you so much. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you so much for very interesting comments for the two questions we've had from the beginning. And we're now seeing some questions being submitted from the audience. So I would like to take a few. The first question is addressed to Shume. I'll read it. How do you think small-scale sustainability innovations and experiments can be scaled up to actual implementation measures in urban planning, especially in developing nations and emerging markets?
Thank you for the question. This is a huge question, actually. If I know the answer right away, then I think I have solutions to many of the problems. And for researchers, this is a really, really interesting question to explore. Why some of the innovations can become so successful and can spread, just like fire to others, whereas others, really remain as individual success stories rather than being copied by others. I think in order for some of the innovations to work through across different contexts, I think there are sort of preconditions, or there are things that needs to be done, because this process is not really a copy and paste process. And I think in some of our, I probably didn't highlight that today, some of our work published, I think 2 years ago, we looked at energy contract practice that has been so successful in USA and then Europe, and then try to look at the process of introducing that to Shanghai. And we found from analyzing that case is that this process of translation or learning Actually, if you analyze the process, it's almost the same as the initial innovation process. You have to realign the actors, you have to realign the resources, including financial resources, and you also have to realign the institutional aspect within your city in order to be able to learn from some of the successful stories. So I think this probably explains why innovations don't always readily replicated in other part of the world. And I think there are more work needs to be done to really understand the mechanisms, the internal mechanism of how innovations actually work across different contexts. And it's still ongoing, and it interests me greatly. And some of my students are still working on this topic. And I really would like to invite many of you who's interested to really look at that, because unless we can upscale some of the small success stories, we cannot really achieve success at scale. And success at scale is exactly what we need right now in order to achieve the transition to sustainability.
Thank you very much. Does any other panelist wants to add to what Shumi has said? Okay, Monica, please.
Just a very small comment on this learning process from success stories. We need to learn to document those success stories more regularly, more systematically, and then do some sort of analysis so that there are places where we can extract what led to the success, rather than just initiate new projects, small scale projects from scratch all the time, since without learning from what has been already done. And there are many, they're scattered all over the place. Different groups are doing these things. Surely many are replicating. So we could be more effective if we had a system to capture the success story, learn from them. That's kind of a piece of research, right? Learn from them, and then disseminate that learning so that basically others can start from the next step rather than from scratch.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to the second question. This question is not specifically addressed to any particular panelist, so please raise your hand if you think that this question is mine. Okay. Many cities or local governments are still struggling with the implementation of sustainable practices and technologies. Do you think that increased public participation and citizens' initiatives could play an important role for the achievement of the SDGs in cities? And if so, do you know of any examples where this is already being done successfully? So the participation of citizens. Okay, Monica, once again, please.
I'll have a go with this one because we have a strong interest in nature sustainability about citizen science, and we see a lot of these things are starting to emerge quite regularly, like in neighborhoods and urban communities. Citizens are coming together and they're collecting data, and this is for soil pollution in urban gardening. There are cases in Australia, there are cases everywhere of citizen science collecting data on the quality of soils in urban areas. That's just an example. Other examples that I've heard of are citizens collecting data on pollution discharges in rivers close to industrial facilities. And I can go on. Plastic pollution. There are cases, and we highlighted the cases in Ghana, where basically citizens were coming together as a collective to actually collect the data, create the database, and handing the database with the help of academics to ensure some kind of rigor in the data collection, and handing then the database to policymakers. That's a form of participation that comes from the bottom up and is increasingly happening. And there are now standards that are being established for these practices to be robust and for this data, for example, and this form of participation to contribute to the work of researchers and scholars, and ultimately feed into policymaking. So I think it's very important that citizens play a role, and they can shape a lot of what the decisions are at city level.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you also had your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an important question on the role of local communities. And there are quite a few examples around the world where cities actually took the full range of SDGs, all the 17 of them, and decided to let's scale them down and see what each one of them means for our city, and have people engaging in developing how could we now implement this. So Baltimore is one example where they actually took all these 17 SDGs and started to work with them within the municipality with quite some success. But I think there was one lesson learned, and it's just building on bottom-up processes is necessary, but probably not sufficient, because for this to have succeeded and being more long-lived and having a greater impact, it would also have needed support, top-down support from the federal government. And during the Trump administration, there was very little interest in supporting any of these initiatives. So unfortunately, they made sort of all these good efforts, but it tended to fade away. And I think this is a lesson we also need to have.
Very good lessons to learn. Thank you very much. Any other people? Okay, Naomi?
Yeah. So this is not limited to urban gardening issues, but in general. So if some spaces for community is made from top-down approach, eventually community will not use the space in most cases, I observed. So the reason is people enjoy the process of making spaces by themselves, and the result, the landscape might not be look fancy or perfect, but still people love the space, and they use the space in creative way. So that kind of process is really important. So I think citizen participation is really important. And in my presentation, I showed one example of social city program of Germany, and it looks top-down approach, but actually they support community. So they support bottom-up approach in the community. So it looks top-down, but bottom-up. And I also saw some projects in Christchurch, New Zealand, after the great earthquake in 2011. And there are many community groups, citizen groups, to use vacant spaces happened after the earthquake, use for a very creative way. So they enjoyed music there, or they enjoyed movie there temporarily. And such process encouraged people for disaster recovery. So citizen participation is very important from many perspectives.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the third question. This is addressed to Phil. What is your vision for empowering and including researchers from the global south or marginalized groups, and especially young career researchers, in order to increase their participation and impact for urban sustainability?
So this is a major, major challenge. It's a challenge, as I see it, just to make some generalizations, that in some countries, researchers are not judged on their publishing records even. In some countries, the resources are very poor, so it's hard to do research. What we absolutely are focusing on is how to increase the diversity of our authorship, the diversity of our peer review, the diversity of the editorship of our journals, the editorial board members, and so on. And we have a whole program that is trying to do that. And an end result of that should be, I would hope, more opportunities for young researchers in developing countries or lower and middle income countries. I think the one other thing I would say is, and I mean, this is not a well-developed point, but it was very struck by the picture of Africa with very different, people tend to talk about the global south, or they talk about Africa, and then you look at each country, or you look at each city actually in this context, and there is different levels of sophistication, different levels of engagement, et cetera, and I think it would be great for us as a company perhaps to start targeting some specific areas within the global south with specific types, themes, if you like, of research, whether it's cities or aquaculture or whatever, it doesn't matter what. That's a sort of practical way forward rather than this sort of miasma of the big problem. So I'm not sure how far that'll get us, but we're absolutely keen to get suggestions from anyone else on this panel about how to do better.
Thank you very much. The timing is running out. We have 10 minutes left and we have 6 panelists. So I'm very sorry for bad time management, but please have 1 minute, very short comment each to wrap up this important conversation. I want to start from Monica because I think you may have some additional comments to this third question as well. So please.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned the global north and global south divide in my presentation, and it's a huge issue. I think it's also a missed opportunity. That's how I see it. We always talk about, the divide, global north, global south, and think that the global north has to invest in the global south, and this is going to be a costly investment. But I think it's an opportunity. The global south is striving with, things we can learn from. There are not just things that needs to be ameliorated. There are things that we can learn from. And we should start thinking about the global south that way, whether it's at city levels or a more regional level, like, engaging with them and helping them to build capacity because it's an opportunity for learning as well as for reducing inequality.
Thank you very much. Naomi, please.
Yes. So we talked about many issues in terms of inequity, and we also talked about technology. And now, thanks to technology, everyone can, not everyone, but more and more people can join this kind of opportunity. And I actually heard inside this audience, there are many people from Global South today. So we need more opportunities like this, and we can discuss such inequity issues more and more, and maybe the world is changing more faster, I guess.
Thank you very much. Masashi?
I recognize that the topic of urban sustainability covers a wide range of issues about global environmental sustainability. But I think recent technological advancement has great potential to solve some of these issues related to the sustainability of urban areas. So yes, I think much more cross-disciplinary collaborations like here are necessary to increase our understanding of this topic.
Thank you very much. Thomas?
Thank you. I think I want to emphasize that sustainability is like an endless process, and the 2030 sort of endpoint for the SDGs is just one stop, and there has to be something coming beyond, which will hopefully be even more forceful. And I will urge the research community in preparation for what will happen beyond 2030 is that we engage very deeply with researchers in the Global South to take stock of experiences and lessons learned so far, but also to develop what would be the vision beyond 2030, and how can we get the research community in the Global South really on board to provide and fill in some of the enormous knowledge gaps we have, and which is needed to accomplish this. So.
Thank you very much, Phil.
I think the point I would make is about climate change. I think climate change is almost like an elephant in the room that people do talk about, but nevertheless, I don't think people are fully grasping in research the magnitude of what we now see happening and what its impacts are going to be. So this isn't so much about cities and nature and that relationship, it is about a more fundamental picture. So for example, what's going to be happening in cities in terms of migration, in terms of all the different things that are coming our way. So I would just say climate change, climate change, climate change. I think we just need to start thinking about the unthinkable to a greater degree than we are.
Thank you very much. Shumei.
I think I would like to really emphasize the importance of really building this context-specific urban knowledge, and for our, for our knowledge production system to really actually encourage that kind of knowledge production, and also give some credit and highlight into that kind of work. Because if we look at how urban science is done so far, I don't think we have put too much emphasis and importance into those really deep diving kind of context-specific urban research. And they're very often dismissed as anecdotal. But can we really look beyond this anecdotalness and then try to really extract the deep knowledge out of this context-specific urban knowledge? I think this is a challenge for us as researchers and for our publishers probably, and collectively, which is really important for finding solutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. I think today we've learned a lot about how we should frame the discussions related to sustainable cities. We've learned about some of the keywords related to this specific topic. We've learned some of the very interesting success stories. And because this symposium is organized by the University of Tokyo, the huge group of academic people, and also by the publisher, I think we were able to come up with more concrete ideas as to how we may be able to move forward, how we could be able to collaborate with various people around the world, and not only with researchers, but with many other stakeholders. And I hope all the listeners who are here in this room today and also online, I hope we will be able to really start making progress as to how we could move by talking about sustainable cities, and also about the relationship between sustainable cities and other dimension of the problem, including climate change and all the other social and environmental problems. So once again, thank you so much to the panelists. Please give big hands to the panelists. Thank you so much.
Okay, so yeah, we hope everyone enjoyed the discussion, and thank you once again for sending over your questions. And again, thank you to Professor Kameyama and all the panelists for very exciting, lively, and insightful discussion. So now we are coming to an end, and we will now have closing remarks from Dr. Antoine Bouquet, who is the Managing Director of Springer Nature Japan. So to introduce Tony, In addition to being a managing director in Japan, he is the vice president of institutional sales in Japan, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, looking after all institutional sales in those regions. He is an Australian by birth, and Tony holds a PhD from University of Tokyo in physics. I would like to hand over to Tony for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Hiro. So to our distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this symposium, so I'm honored to give some closing remarks. Today's event has brought together experts from academia and publishing who are all committed to addressing the world's most pressing challenges as defined by the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, particularly SDG 11 and the relationship between cities and nature. Both the University in Tokyo and Springer Nature, who co-organized this event, we share a common goal of promoting effective collaboration between researchers in order to tackle these sort of challenges. So we're delighted to have had the opportunity to bring together communities of people from different fields to develop new partnerships and ways of collaborating. At Springer Nature, we believe that our publishing activity plays a crucial role in contributing towards the SDGs. By disseminating important knowledge related to the SDGs, we aim to support researchers, academics, policymakers, and businesses from around the world in accelerating progress towards these goals. So since their launch in 2015, Springer Nature has published over 390,000 articles or books chapters related to the SDGs, and they have been collectively cited more than 3.5 million times. This reflects our commitment to promoting research that supports the SDGs, and also our belief in the importance of open research in widening access to and increasing the impact of the science beyond just academic circles. Global open research plays a critical role in increasing the accessibility and impact of science. In 2021, Springer Nature's transformative journals published 40% more open access research articles than the year before, which makes research content available to anyone, from researchers to policymakers, practitioners, students, and the general public. The SDGs have also prompted Springer Nature to develop new ways of working and seek out new partnerships across our business and other sectors. We've introduced new formats and approaches to internal collaboration and facilitated more opportunities for our teams to connect. We've also created new opportunities to link research and interdisciplinary experts with decision makers by building on the power of the brands such as Nature and Scientific American. One example is that this year, or in 2022, we signed a first of its kind sponsorship agreement for open access books with Lyrasis, a US non-profit membership association of libraries, archives, and museums. This agreement will provide free access to research in critical areas that support the SDGs through the publication of new open access book titles focused on climate change, equity, peace, and justice. So during this symposium, we've had the pleasure of hearing from leading researchers working in the area of SDG 11 and related goals. We were introduced to the importance of connecting cities to nature, the environment, and the planet by Professor Bai in her keynote address. And Philip Campbell also spoke about the role of research and publishing in addressing societal changes and impact. The very lively panel discussion we've just heard also gave us important insights into SDG-related research on the intersection of cities, nature, technologies, and policies. So I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all our speakers and panelists, contributors and guests for making this event a great success. I'd like to extend my special thanks to President Fujii and the University of Tokyo for working with Springer Nature to make this event a reality and continuing the long-standing collaboration over many years. I do hope that we will see this event continue in the future for a considerable amount of time. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you, our audience, both in the room with us and virtually, for your participation and interest in the critical topics discussed today. We had over 1,400 participants registered for the event, accessing from over 97 different countries. And so I think this event serves as an excellent model for how communication with a broader audience on research topics can shape our society's approach to tackling some of the world's most difficult challenges. So thank you again.
Thank you, Tony, for the closing remark. So thank you very much to all the speakers, our moderator, and to all the participants on site, online, for joining us today. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the University of Tokyo for their tremendous support, and also our colleagues at Springer Nature. One final quick note, please do access the short survey from the QR code on the screen. Your feedbacks and comments are incredibly informative and important for both the University of Tokyo and Springer Nature. Also, please do return the receiver for the simultaneous interpretation back to the reception desk. Thank you very much once again, and we look forward to seeing you again in our future events. Thank you.